Now, I know I'm supposed to talk for an hour, and then we have a discussion, but we all know from research that 20 minutes is the maximum period of human concentration. So I'm very happy to take questions as I talk. You know, I may not take them all, but if there are things you want to interrogate, then please do. I mean it. Don't, you know, I say this to audiences and then they stay quiet, but please just interrupt. I'm going to try and put what I'm saying into the frame that Martin started with yesterday. That is, before working on governing education and the changing role of knowledge, I want to briefly indicate where that fits within the two main ideas we seem to be working with here. Firstly, what is theory for, and how can we engage with theory? And related to that, how do we understand Europeanization? So I thought it would be fair to you and may be helpful if I put my cards on the table and explained how I see these questions, not as an encouragement to think like me, but just as a way of clarifying what's going to come, because sometimes we don't make these positions very explicit. I'm a very theory-driven person. Unlike Martin, my curiosity level isn't too high. I mean, he says I haven't got any. I think that's a little unfair. But what I get curious about is how well theories explain the world, or make a problem intelligible, or give me tools with which I can work on a problem. So I start from the theory, and I don't believe that you can do any decent research until you know what your theoretical position is. Maybe not every joined up dot and comma, but how you see the world, how you understand what problems are, how they're constituted, how you think about those problems, or where they come from, who constructs them, whose interests are served. I think it's probably becoming obvious that my overarching interest is in why education makes so many promises and fails to deliver them. Why it is that education is possibly best understood as a means of maintaining inequalities and unequal power relations rather than as a means of challenging them. So I have this interest in power and how education works to mobilize resources for the powerful. Yeah? So that's the broad kind of frame of where I'm coming from, very briefly summarized. And in terms of Europeanization, that gives me rather more of a political view of Europeanization than some people have. So I'm looking at it as a political project, as an attempt to construct a bloc, a powerful bloc that engages in competition globally with other power blocs, other trading blocs, other economic powers. And I see that as a deliberate project, as a construction that's attempting to build some kind of economic, but also political and social entity in a policy space. And that doesn't mean, however, that I think only about Europeanization in top-down ways, because I think that building, that construction is going on everywhere, not just in levels, but across and between national, transnational, institutional, individual spaces. So, for example, the way we've tried to work with this is to reduce that enormous frame of reference to something workable, because you know that's the problem. I have these ideas. How do I then get that to translate into a practical research question? One of the ways that we've found of doing this is to find actors who are positioned in particular places. So they're transnational, national, individual, institutional actors simultaneously. And people like policy analysts, statisticians, inspectors of schools are exactly those kinds of people. They carry a project with them, of Europeanization, but at the same time, they're working with their home institutions or policies. And they have the same, they have this, if you like, complex multiple identity, which is both technocratic, in that they're working with regulatory instruments that are knowledge-based, but they're also experts, and they have their own professional expertise, and they embody that expertise. So there's a really complex set of layers of exploration, I think, in pursuing such people. So that's just a preliminary to try and locate the rest of what I'm going to say, which is going to be very much about research, which has been done collaboratively. I would really like to stress that this is not all my own work. A lot of it's been done with Martin, but also particularly with Luis Miguel Carvalho, with John Clark, whose work you may know on the new managerialism, with Sotiria Grec, and with Eric Manger. So the work I'm going to talk about isn't all mine, but the angle I have on it is, so I take responsibility for that, but I don't take credit for all the research. So what we've been trying to do over the last, actually it's nearly 20 years, is figure out how to get education on the agenda. I think Martin touched on this yesterday. How to get political scientists and sociologists to see that if they're thinking about governing and governing in Europe, they need to include education as part of their field of inquiry. We were also increasingly, and this will be my main topic, driven to see that knowledge-based processes were really, really important in the work that these actors were doing. They were making a policy space through the use of instruments like benchmarks and performance data. And as I said a moment ago, we started to focus in particular on policy actors. And inspectors of education turned out, I think, to be a very productive case. So many of our colleagues couldn't believe that we were going to do research on inspection. They thought it was terribly boring. I think they were very wrong. And in my most recent work, the work I'm doing at the moment, I've started to look at elites and try to understand if elite policymakers are being displaced by new technocrats. So as Martin said yesterday, and I'm sure this will be available to you, the slides, and I'm aware that there's too much information on them. I can't break the habit. So you will get access to them later, I'm sure. What we were interested in was thinking about Europe being made, but being made through governing processes. Because as I said at the beginning, my perspective is on this as a project, as a deliberate project, as a project that's being constructed with a purpose, not necessarily a purpose that's achieved, but it's intended. So it's the construction of Europe through governing that really makes my curiosity level rise. And so we were looking at how there are these new relations between different groupings, different interests, different actors, new agents becoming involved in this governing process. And this fits into, as you know, if you had a look at Mark Bevier's free publication online, this fits into current scholarship on governing, that there is a big movement to move away from government as the focus of interest into something else, though that something else remains contested and rather unsettled. So we as a group of researchers really wanted to focus on governing to get the sense of activity, of new actors, of new forms of engagement, and get away from government, which is very steady and stable and established, to capture that sense of action and of new actors involved in in these processes, to capture that sense of fluidity, hybridity. And increasingly, as we worked through these projects, I became really fixed on the importance of knowledge as a resource for these new governing processes. And more than that, the way in which there were different kinds of knowledge being brought to the table in these new situations. I have some notes here because I'm talking about 20 years worth of work, and I digress very easily. So I've got to try and keep myself disciplined, so forgive me if I put a check on myself from time to time. Okay. So as I said a moment ago, there's this new interest in how we conceptualize what used to be a very stable, static, political science-dominated field of activity, government, in which institutions were the focus of study. And they were understood as having almost their own characteristics and lives, their capacity to produce norms, to behave in particular ways, which allowed political scientists to build the models that they are deeply attached to. And really what we were trying to do was say, this doesn't work anymore. That search for stability, which is always accompanied, I think, by a search to make things work better, was actually not that interesting, nor even very current. What we wanted to capture was the uncertainty, the fluidity, the constant shifting, the changes, the uncertainty, and the competition that went on among different actors in terms of who was going to set the agenda. And of course, as you know, there are different ways of doing this. Governmentality does it in one way, in terms of the capillaries of power and the capacity of the governing project to deliver right down and especially through the individual consciousness. We had lots of discussions about governmentality in our project, and we were persuaded, particularly by John Clarke's argument, that this tended to fix time too rigidly and to also assume that there was a degree of success behind the project that we didn't really want to sign up to. We wanted to keep more of the situation open, more of the possibilities open. Now, I know there are arguments about how one interprets Foucault, but can we park those for the moment and just move on to say that as a consequence, we were persuaded by John's argument that we should think of governing, that should be our key concept, because it was active, because it allowed for turbulence, because it also drew attention to the fact that this was something that moved and shape-shifted and actually formed the object of governance in the process of doing the governing. So there's a moving object, a benchmark, a data set, that gets shifted, altered, and reinterpreted as governing processes develop. Those were our key thoughts. And one more thing in relation to knowledge and why knowledge became important. Yeah, I don't want to do a bit of vanity ethnography here. I'll save that for later, talking about myself at length. But it did occur to me eventually, it took me a long time, that actually my interest in knowledge had been there since I started work in the 1970s, when I was working for a teacher union trying to understand what basis they had for developing policies. And so when I began to see that this way of thinking about governing actually allowed for the activation of interest in knowledge, I was really energized by it. And I think then that opens up a lot of interesting questions. What is meant by knowledge here? And I don't mean that philosophically, because that's another avenue altogether. But what kind of knowledge is valorized in these governing processes? What kinds of expertise count? What happens when new forms of valorized knowledge, things like consultancy, as Martin said yesterday, when they collide with embodied knowledges that public sector professionals carry within them? How do these things get aligned? Can they be aligned? Or do they produce conflict? So it's those thoughts about knowledge that I'm working with. And I think there's also a way of thinking about how these new governing practices privilege certain kinds of knowledge. So they're looking for people who can bring solutions to complex problems, who can apply ideas across all services. So generalizable knowledge is highly valued. Financial knowledge has a high status in this context. And people who bring relevant knowledge are also valued if they can translate that knowledge into what Grunban and Ster call the levers for action. If they can translate the knowledge into practical outcomes that policymakers can understand. So there's a whole set of knowledge capacities to do with translating, transacting, moving knowledge into practical activity that's privileged, I would argue, in these new governing forms.